Okay, welcome. This is a short overview of the victimology and victims of crime section of your pack using page 64 to 68. Now, you may have already completed this section, you may have finished it already, so don't feel that you need to go through this work slide by slide and listen to every single bit. But I would say if there's any areas you're not familiar with or you couldn't work out the answers, use this as a way of just clarifying your understanding. While we're on this, I would like to say just well done to you guys. I know this is a very odd arrangement, working from home. The fact that exams have been cancelled, again, adds a stranger notion that you're doing this for just to finish the course. And we are very close to the end. The last few topics are particularly interesting ones. So I would encourage you to keep going with this and just, keep going with this topic. But as I say, nonetheless, I do appreciate this is a very odd situation for you all. So victimology. So what do we need to know? And we'll see how does this relate to this topic. So the main thing that we'll start with are the definitions. So victimology is the study of a victim. It tries to identify anyone who's been a victim of some form of crime. And that could be physical harm, emotional harm, sort of mental suffering, economic loss, impairment of basic rights. So it's to look at someone who's suffered. Now, this has been going on since the 1980s. This relates back to realism and their view that that victimology has been a growing area of concern. If you think back to what the realists had to say, that there was a real fear of crime, that crime was a genuine issue. So it has its origins in this movement. This has both been caused by and led to a rapid growth in victim surveys. So examples like the crime survey for England and Wales, or the British crime survey, or smaller scale surveys like the Islington crime survey, which ask people to identify and explain crimes that they have been a victim of. And again, this has been part of the driving force behind the study of victimology. And as we say, the crime survey, it highlights what we call a dark figure of crime. Official police stats are one way of understanding crime, but they are a very limited scope provided. One of the things we talked about previously is that for every 100 criminal acts that take place, only 1% or 1 in that 100 will appear in crime stats. And because along the way they don't get reported or they're not investigated, they don't find someone to convict. So this is what we see causing this concept of a dark figure of crime. And again, this idea that there's this hidden mass of crimes. And if you imagine a bit like an iceberg sort of floating above the surface, so you kind of have the bit above the water that you can see, and then also you have our water line here, and then below that is this whole mass of larger crimes that we don't see, we don't become aware of because they're not reported in statistics. And this is kind of what is this dark figure of crime. Okay, so before we get into this, one of the things I want you just to think about just for 30 seconds or so is, what have we already seen about victims? So just have a quick think, either on your own or if you're talking to someone at home, and see what you can come up with. Okay, there we go. So 30 seconds, just have a quick think, as I said. Now, with crime and demons, there's lots of ways it's come up in various parts of the pack, and some of it's subtle, some of it's quite hidden, some of it is quite obvious. Now, this whole topic is about the study of crime and deviance. Now, when there's a crime, there's often a victim. So in the theoretical perspectives, we've had a little bit of a think about who are victims of crime, why people experience victimization. Think back to feminism, talking about how women are experiencing patriarchy, that the working class are victims in the sense of victims of capitalism, so they get scapegoated, and obviously it could explain why some groups are more likely to be victims of crime. Functionalism, obviously more about the role crime has in presenting and reinforcing social norms, but obviously again victims have a part of that. That when we see someone become a victim of a crime, it reinforces that certain behaviours are not okay and acceptable. Labelling theory, in some respects, we could look at the individuals who are labelled as victims of labelling processes. So again, there's ways of labelling has appeared in theory. I think even postmodernism, the whole social harm and how we define crime and a victim. Now, realism obviously is all about the victims. We know it talks about how certain groups are more likely to be victims of crime. It does tend to focus on criminals and why people commit crime, but there is also this underlying notion of certain groups being more prone to victimization. And patterns of offending, which is linked to victimization. It's part of your work this week. So again, we think about who is committing crime and who they're committing crime against. We find that there are patterns that those who commit crime, like the working class, are more likely to be victims of crime. So there are these kind of notions of intra-crime taking place. And although we haven't got there yet, media will have a lot of discussion about victims and the misrepresentation of victims, and globalization also has a part to play. Again, talking about how this has created victims on a global scale, that you can be a victim of a criminal in another country through cyber crimes and the like. So again, it's this mass spread of victimization. So let's move on to the importance of victims within the criminal justice system, and also the evidence we have that shows that the criminal justice system has become more victim-centred. Now, the first of these is, as we see in the top left here, that victims are becoming seen as customers. So the criminal justice system sees the sort of victims of crime as customers. They are going in, they're getting a service, they're expecting justice of some kind through the criminal justice system. And also we see the criminal justice system as a way of dealing with offenders and gaining some kind of outcome. And that's obviously why we have units like victim support units and agencies, which again help us to understand and deal with the criminal justice system. Most people who are involved, or people who aren't often involved in the criminal justice system, don't know how to navigate it. So part of this process is sort of providing support for these individuals. Second, on the top right, is there's a growing emphasis on restorative justice. So making people victims the opportunity to confront offenders and seek apologies or remorse. And again, also in that terms of restorative justice, we see this, thinking back to labelling theory and Braithwaite, the reintegrative shaming. A lot of the criminal justice systems punish someone and then allow them to return to society. Bottom left, we've got the 2013 Home Office announcement that victims of low-level antisocial crime should be able to effectively choose from a list the punishments or out-of-court punishments that can be given to the offender. And that could be fines, that could be community service, that could be sort of making them take part in voluntary schemes. So again, it could be figuring out what way you want to punish someone. And then last but not least, in 2002, a new policy was introduced where police must record crime and give priority to the evidence that victims put forward, so their accounts of crime deviance. So these have to become forward. So that's how the criminal justice system started to focus more on victims. Now, obviously, the criticism of this, as you can see, is that not all victims are treated equally. So what counts as a victim is socially constructed, coming back to labelling theories and interactionism, that for someone to be labelled as a victim, they often need to fit particular views and characteristics of a victim. And even the fact that in some cases, women particularly go through the criminal justice system, they can be equally judged as responsible for experiencing crimes, particularly in sexual abuse cases. We also have stuff like domestic violence, white collar fraud, corporate crimes. These are often not seen as criminal. And again, think about environmental crimes. The environment, is not always seen as a victim, So this can be sometimes problematic. We've also got the idea that some people are denied labels of victims. So they are blamed for victimization. So when older people or people fall for scams, people not protecting themselves. So, for example, victims of homophobia attacks are sometimes seen as being responsible because of the lifestyle they're choosing, or their dress, or their mannerisms, so that they have, in some cases, invited homophobia and abuse. So again, it doesn't always work for the interests of victims. Now, this relates to page 65. So on 65, there are the 5 ways in which victimization can have an impact on individuals and communities. And we'll just quickly fly through these, and obviously this gives you some of the materials to place into the table. So firstly, we've got the physical and emotional impact. So if someone is a victim of crime, whether it's an assault, whether it's a mugging, whether it's some kind of abuse, there is a physical and an emotional harm. So again, being a victim of a crime, you are physically injured, and therefore that's going to have an impact on your day-to-day living. There's also the emotional impact. So you can create feelings of helplessness, lead to social isolation, it can disrupt sleep, and it can obviously have a significant impact on individuals. Thinking about obviously how that relates to the next one about victimization and fear of crime, this graph just highlights that there is this division. So particularly looking at some of the elements on here, when it comes to violent crime, women are particularly sort of more likely to fear violent crime compared to men. When it comes to income, so lower incomes are more likely to fear crime. Age doesn't seem to have that much of a difference. And also the last one is about location, but these are based in Northern Ireland. When it comes to burglary, again, women are more likely to fear burglary than men. Age doesn't seem to have a difference. Location doesn't really have that much of a difference, but income definitely does. So think back to realism. It's the working class who are the most likely to be victims. They're the ones who fear crime. When we look at gender, women are more likely to fear crime because of the way the society creates this notion that women are more likely to be victims, and that's going to come up in media later. So that can also be significant ones to consider. Now, we also have this notion, as I say, that crime can create indirect victims. So friends, relatives, witnesses of a crime, they will also suffer as a result. The next one is hate crime. So if you have a hate crime against a community, it creates a wave of harm. And this radiates out. It's a message crime. So some form of gang violence or intimidation, it can affect a whole community. It can put a whole community in fear of victimization, and it can change the way they behave, their activities, whether they go out, because there's this message crime. So it's not just the primary victim, but then it creates victims of a community because that fear of experiencing similar outcomes. So we'll see the Lee Rigby murder, or the Woolwich soldier, if you have a look into that case. That's a good example of obviously a hate crime. Even the Joe Cox murder, I think we can see in a similar way that because it had links to white supremacy, and because she was a Remain campaigner, an individual involved was a sort of very adamant Leave campaigner, but also had connections to Nazism and all sorts. So again, hate crimes would create a wave of harm. We also see secondary victimization. So the idea that people become judged and they feel very attacked and judged by the criminal justice system because of obviously having to deal with a case. So as I mentioned before, rape victims or sexual assault victims can face further victimization. A really good one to look at is in the case of Brock Turner, when his victim had to go to court and testify, and again she had to answer a very lengthy list of probing questions, which talked about questioned her sexuality, her sexual preferences. It asked about whether she was faithful or whether she cheated on her boyfriend in the past. Did she wear clothes that were provocative to attract boys' attention? Kind of very, very judgmental questions. And ultimately, when it came to the end of the testimony, when she's defending herself, the fact that because she was date raped and drugged, they then dismissed a lot of her testimony because she wasn't deemed a credible witness, because she didn't remember it clearly on the case of being drugged by her attacker. So again, even the victim in this case she was judged more severely in some cases than the rapist Brock Turner in this case. And then last but not least, we see fear of victimization. So people become scared of being a victim of crime. Very similar way to the indirect victims and the waves of harm, but ultimately when a crime takes place, it can create a fear of victimization. So women are afraid going out at night because of the notion that, you know, this idea that women are victims of crime, or more likely to be a victim of crime, despite the fact it's actually generally young men who are more likely to be that victim, which relates to misrepresentations that we'll see later. Okay. Moving on to the bottom of 65, we just have the two kind of theoretical approaches for victimization and victimology. So we have the positivist victimology and the critical victimology. Now, the critical victimology, as you can see, it does relate to conflict theory. So this is our Marxism, feminism. It brings in a little bit of potentially a little bit left realism with Lee and Young, but ultimately it's this idea that, you know, there is an inequality. Positivist victimology isn't so clearly linked to positivism as an approach, probably closely linked to, I would say, new right realism and their views. So we'll quickly just recap those, and then there's a task on the following page for you to attempt. So this focusing on interpersonal crimes, positivism. So this is the work of Mears, not me, but another Mears or Myers, and it identifies three features, three key elements. Now, again, I know there's, as you can say, there's 5 bullet points in your pack, but some of these are kind of broken down. So the first thing, it focuses on interpersonal crimes of violence. So that's the main thing it focuses on, violent crime. So it isn't really considering other forms of crime. It aims to identify the factors that led to someone becoming a victim. So it talks about stuff like victim proneness and victim participation. So proneness is the characteristics. Is someone more likely to be vulnerable? Have they put themselves in a vulnerable position? It covers stuff like learning disabilities. Does that mean that they are in a position where they're more likely to be a victim? You also see precipitation, so behaviours that make victims to blame for their victimisation. So positivist victimology kind of tries to identify who is going to be a victim and what has led them to that. So with that precipitation, it might be, going out late at night, being drunk, advertising or flashing like a phone or some kind of equipment. So again, it's things that could draw attention and make you more likely to be a victim of crime. And again, that's the positivism. So very much focusing on the individual and what they have done to either entice or prevent being a victim. Critical victimology, I say, it's more the left wing, it's the Marxist, the feminist, a little bit of left realism in here, and it looks at wider social issues, wider structural causes of patterns of victimization. So this might be looking at the criminal justice system. It could be looking at whether society is patriarchal, looking at poverty, looking at capitalism, all these things as a cause of victimization. And he's very critical. Again, these are two opposite opinions. So critical victimology, very good evaluation of the positivist. But the main reason they see victimology happening is social deprivation. It's the poorest, weakest, most deprived citizens who are most likely to be victims of crime, relating to realism as a theory. There's a lack of protection for groups, so particularly ethnic minorities, by the criminal justice system. The social inequalities of working class, gender, ethnicity. So again, it can cause certain groups to be disadvantaged as they enter the criminal justice system as a victim of crime. And lastly, they also talk about the power of the state. The power of the state to deny a victim or to deny a label is that, as we said before, the notion of being a victim is a social construct, and the criminal justice system, the state, can decide whether you are a victim or not and whether you meet the criteria. So in the sense of this unofficial label that, whether you're treated as a victim of a crime or whether you have been involved in the events that, so again, sometimes we talk about gender and women being treated differently within the criminal justice system. Assault victims may not be labelled as a victim, that they've led to it, or they've invited some form of crime, so they've not been innocent in the process. Now on page 66, we've got this key perspectives, these statements and who they relate to. So I'll just give you the answers to these next 2 pages. So with the positivist theories, we've got Hans von Henting. who talks about how female, elderly or mentally ill people are more likely to be a victim of crime. And he implied that there was this sense of invitation, that their low status or their vulnerable nature invited crime in. So again, the idea that they are the sort of proneness of victimization. And you've also got Wolfgang, who's a positivist, who talks about homicides in Philadelphia, and that in 26% of cases the victim precipitation involved, that the victim triggered the events that led to the homicide. For example, being the first to use violence, or carrying a gun, or bringing a weapon to some form of altercation. So again, positivist approach is very much the victim has a role to play. The critical theories, Toombs and White, in both cases. So as we mentioned, foul to label people as victims. Looks at hierarchy of victimization, who is more or less likely to be victimized or labeled as a victim, sorry. We know that safety crimes, where employers have led to or violated the law, which led to the death of the workers, often the worker is blamed. Health and safety laws, we know from Marxism, are a key example of this, that it is not there to protect the worker, it's there to protect the employer. And then we've got Walby and Walke, who argue that victimization is a form of structural powerlessness, claiming that the stereotypical ideal victim is weak, innocent and blameless. So again, we have this notion of who is a victim and whether they meet the criteria of a victim. And then the graph at the bottom, the evaluation points, again, you've got your answers here just to check your own working. Now, main things, obviously, these are positive and negative evaluations, mostly negative, but we'll just quickly, obviously, you can see the answers here. So for positivist victimology, a criticism is that it is victim blaming. It blames the victim, for leading to them being a victim of crime. It downplays the role of the police, the criminal justice system, in tackling crime. Again, putting a lot of the emphasis of someone being a victim, it's down to the victim. It's not about the environment or the police or their involvement. It's all down to the victim and whether they made themselves a victim. And that last one, it's got some positive in there, that it identifies certain patterns of victimization, but it does generally ignore the structural factors that influence victimization. So poverty, patriarchy, capitalism. So it does have its merits, and it does identify that there are some common patterns, but not everything's addressed. For critical victimology, you've got a pro and a con. So the weakness is it disregards the role of the victim. So unlike the positivists, who kind of think about what the victim was doing that led to victimization, critical victimology ignores that. With the strength is a valuable drawing attention to the victim status. So again, how that is constructed by powerful groups, how this benefits particular social groups, how the criminal justice system have a role in defining someone as a victim. So there are some pros to the theory itself. And then very lastly, I just wanted to flag up a few bits and pieces for page 67. So if we look at the groups, now you've got some different information in your pack, but the theme is pretty much the same. So, for example, as you can see here, with social class, the evidence of this is that the poorest sections of society are more likely to be victims of crime. So in the 2014-15 crime survey for England and Wales, 20% of people living in the poorest areas of society were victims of crime, compared to only 13% of people living in the wealthy. And this relates back to realism again, in the sense of the wealthy having the opportunity to target harder, to have better security, to prevent being a victim. And then in your pack you've got some different explanations, but pretty much a similar theme. Marxism also has this argument that the working class again are victims of crime because of that powerlessness that comes from capitalism. And again, whether the state can define them as a victim. And this last concept, again, it's not in your pack, but it could be one to, if you want to make a note of it, it should be in the PowerPoint you're reading at the moment, is this inverse victimization law. I'm just colouring at the moment. So again, the idea that the most deprived people who have the least material possessions are generally the ones who are more likely to be victims of crime. So often it's the people with the least amount of stuff who are more likely to be the victims. Again, it's not a direct comparison, but even if you think in this current climate of corona with panic buying, the people who are panic buying are often those who have the means and the resources and don't need to be panic buying. The idea, like some of the stories of Argos selling out of fridge freezers because people are buying second or third fridge freezers to stock up on extra food. If you're in a position where you have that disposable income, you have those resources, you don't need to then start buying more resources. And the same happens here, that it's the people who are most likely to be victims of crime, the people who have the least to lose in the first place. When it comes to ethnicity, our next one here, again, victimization is much higher for people who are from ethnic minorities, particularly compared to the white majority in the UK. So you can see most ethnic minorities are going to experience racial or racially motivated crimes. They're a victim of that in itself, but also they're victims, homicide, violence. These are more common for people from ethnic minority backgrounds to experience these crimes, and there's a higher percentage risk. So someone from an ethnic origin has a high risk, 11% risk or 11% chance of becoming a victim, compared to white groups who may only have a 6% chance of being a victim. So there's a big division here. Now, minority groups are more worried about crime, because they're more likely to be victims of it. And racially motivated crimes often are more likely to be put upon ethnic minority groups. And obviously, when it comes to police, ethnic minorities are more likely to report feeling underprotected than other groups, but at the same time, over control. So it's greater degree of control, but feel less protected. For gender, the same divide seems to appear. So women are more likely than men to have higher levels of fear, but women are less likely to be a victim of particular crimes. Particularly young males who are 16 to 24 are twice as likely to be a victim of crime than a young woman, particularly violent crime. And again, this may come back to this idea, women fear victimization, so are less likely to be out and putting themselves in a position where they are likely to be a victim of crime. Young men are more likely to be on the streets, where they're more likely to experience violence. But there are certain types of crime that women are more likely to experience. So honour crimes, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, harassment. And of 150 people being killed by their former or current partner, obviously 80% of those are female. So women are more likely to experience particular types of crime, but the greater likelihood of being a victim of violent or random violent crime are generally men. And then lastly, age. So as I say, the pattern is that obviously it's younger people are more likely to be victims. So as like older people are sometimes fearful of being a victim of crime, the reality is that younger people are 9 times more likely to be a victim of crime than someone who's over 75. And again, it comes back to lifestyle. Young people are out on the streets in an evening when old people aren't. So this comes back to media that you're going to see later in this topic, and the misrepresentation of crime and deviance. And last but not least, the only things left for you to have a go at would be the crossword on page 68. On these slides here that you'll see in the pack, there are some examples and extended reading that you may want to engage in. So some good examples of resisting victimization would be campaigns like Slut Walk. This is not an invitation to rape me campaign. Even the Reclaim the Night in Essex, Colchester. Again, these active movements against this kind of patterns of victimization. Other examples, you can think about Harvey Weinstein, and again the case there, and again who is deemed a victim and why certain people aren't deemed victims, and also the Me Too movement has kind of taken a big step, particularly with as I say, 300,000 men join the Me Too movement. So again, that could be also good examples for victimology to consider. Okay. And then just lastly, the exam questions. So just as you can see, I'm going to put some exam questions on the screen. These are on the PowerPoint you've already got. Feel free to take a look at them, think about how you plan them. The main thing about victimization questions, as you can see here, is it's always asking you to think about why, and there's some words that we'll highlight. So it might be some groups are more likely to be a victim of crime. They might be specific and say, why are women more likely to be a victim of of some types of crime? But they might ask, why are young men more likely to be a victim of crime? But you can have a question why some people may not report crimes. So if you think about the some of the things we talk about, some people may not realize they are a victim of crime. People may not want to come forward because they fear that they will be judged because of their actions that led to being a victim. Obviously, some people are embarrassed, and the criminal justice system may treat them badly. So it's just thinking about why people may not want to report being a victim of crime. And last but not least, the 10 marker, again, thinking about 2 reasons, as we said, why women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence than men. So these questions, a little bit familiar, but again, it's highlighting the key words in there. So why are women more likely of domestic violence? And again, the item does give you some indication. So women are more likely to experience repeat victimization, high levels of fear of it. They're more, can be coercive and controlled. So we could link it back to patriarchy. We can even think about some of the sort of power positions. So women obviously weaker positions financially, or sort of more subordinate positions. And the 30 marker, if you were to get one, it would be a discussion about the usefulness of approaches. So it might be why positivist methodologies and victimologies are more useful than critical. And again, it can become a debate. So you could talk about the role of what a victim is, you could talk about the role of the criminal justice system, and then discuss the 2 sides and how they explain crime and how the other might challenge their perspective. And you can even relate it to some of the things we touched on. Realism and other theories can be brought in within these discussions. Okay, so this is the last slide, just to sort of leave that question on the screen there for you to have a quick read of the item. If you need to, it is in the PowerPoint you've been sent. And again, just if you want to plan these, feel free to have a look and send them to me, and I can review them. Otherwise, I know this has been a longer video than normal, but I thought I'd go through the section just to help you understand it all. Okay, thanks for watching, and take care.